This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. In the last podcast, I was talking about the situation in China and what seems to be a radical recalibration of the Chinese economic development model around greater equality and greater social justice. And I mentioned the fact that there were three mountains that Xi had suggested needed to be climbed. The first mountain was one of education, where they've already introduced some anti-privatization reforms. Healthcare, where there is a good deal of reconfiguration of the healthcare system, particularly in relationship to the pandemic. And the third one was housing. And I want to talk a little bit about housing, because in 2007, 2008, the crisis in the financial system around the world was largely triggered by a collapse of the housing market in the United States and in Ireland and Spain and various other countries. And the recession, however, was largely offset in 2007, 2008 by a radical expansion in China. And that radical expansion in China focused very much upon urbanization and infrastructure development. Infrastructure in terms of the construction of the high-speed rail network, urbanization, particularly in the construction of huge housing complexes and the emergence of whole new cities, which needed to be lived in. And there were lots of tales, 2007, 2008, of empty cities and things of that kind. Since then, of course, in that process, there was this odd situation that the world got into a crisis because of over investment and overcommitment in the housing market, and got out of the crisis by a huge amount of investment in housing. Maybe as much as 40% of GDP in China was invested in housing in 2008, 2009, which stimulated demand in the global economy for all the things you need, like copper and steel and cement and all those kinds of things. And so the recovery of the global economy was also very much focused on housing. Now, on this point, I just want to make a sidebar. We talk a lot, of course, about financial crises since the 1980 or so, and argue, well, there have been lots of financial crises going on, and everybody sort of talks about the financialization of capitalism and so on. But the interesting thing is that about a third of those crises, by my guess, were actually associated with housing. So it was the housing sector and the formation of what Marx called the consumption fund, or fixed capital in the built environment and all those things, which was the center. And we forget that. So we don't talk about that. We just talk about the financial consequences rather than the actual building that was going on around that requirement of an expansion of the economic system. Now, the thing in China was there was a lot of apartments created. Middle class started to buy apartments. So they started to actually accumulate wealth by buying multiple apartments. So there's a great deal of speculation going on in Chinese property markets. Large companies started to emerge, which were building apartments and renting apartments. So large corporations were emerging. And one of the things that is now evident is that one of the largest housing corporations in China, called Everglades, is actually close to bankruptcy. And so there's a big sort of question mark going around as to whether we're going to see a major bankruptcy in the housing financial sector of China, on a par with the kind of bankruptcies we started to see emerging back in 2007, 2008 about housing in the United States. Meanwhile, as this is going on, the global situation in terms of the property market is getting extremely inflated. We have a lot of quantitative easing going on, a lot of creation of money going on, and that money flows somewhere. It flows into the stock market, but a lot of it is flowing into housing speculation, so that we see housing prices in many markets in the United States have increased by about 20% in 1 year. The same thing has been happening in Britain. Same thing has been happening almost everywhere. And of course, it's been happening in China. So there's a lot of speculative activity going on in China and housing. And the big question for the Chinese is to how to convert that housing in such a way that somehow or other it's going to be open to utilization by the mass of the population. Because right now, a lot of the housing has become, if you like, a vehicle for wealth creation and wealth storage for an increasingly wealthy middle class. So you've got a very serious dilemma in the Chinese case, that you want to make accessibility to housing open to as many people as possible, and you want decent housing and a decent living environment. That's what you would commit to if you're going to climb that mountain. But climbing that mountain is going to mean the dispossession of a lot of the housing which currently exists from the speculative froth that is going on in many of the cities. Now, over the last 20 years, there have been several speculative booms in housing. There was one in Shanghai in 1999. There are others, and I couldn't keep track of them, but others elsewhere. So that the speculation in housing has developed very rapidly, as has the financing of housing. So this kind of question of if a middle-class family wants to buy a house, how does it do it? Does it have cash? Well, sometimes they will. Sometimes they get a loan from somebody, and the sort of financial structure in China was very, very peculiar, with all sorts of Wild West structures there in the 1990s and the 2000s, where a lot of speculative activity was going on, backed by very shady shadow banking practices. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to bring those things under control. They attacked shadow banking practices a few years back, and I think the story says they seem to be largely eliminated now, and it's become much more a better regulated market. But there's still the problem of how the Chinese are going to get to a situation of affordable housing for the mass of the population. Now, I'm now going to switch to this country, but I'm going to switch in a very peculiar kind of way. There's a little debate going on right now, given what is happening in China. How do Western financiers look at the situation? And there is a concordance of views amongst both right-wing and progressive left-wing capitalists like Soros and some of the people on the more right-wing about what they're going to do in China. Are they going to invest in China? And the answer is, in many instances, no, they're not. George Soros basically says, no, it's not worth it. You're going to lose money by going in there because the state's going to likely take away things. The right wing say exactly the same thing, so there's a concordance there. The one place where there's not a concordance is with one company, which is run by Stephen Schwarzman, called Blackstone. Now, Blackstone already has a lot of property management structures in place in China. And it's property management, but it's also property ownership. So it has big ownership, mainly commercial properties, but also in those industrial spaces where, for example, high-tech work is going on. So Schwarzman already has. So Schwarzman is somebody who says, I like to do business in China. What Schwarzman was trying to do until very recently was to take over a quite large company called Soho. That is what Schwarzman was doing, was saying, okay, we can take over Soho, which has a lot of interest in terms of industrial estates and all the rest of it.
This has collapsed, largely because the central government has started to ask too many questions about it, the question of monopoly controls and all the rest of it. So that has collapsed. But Schwartzman wants to get in there as an expert on the provision of affordable housing. Now, this term, affordable housing, is a global term right now. And while we think of it in particular spaces and particular places, it seems to me that it's very important to understand that the question of affordable housing is almost everywhere a significant problem. And it's a problem largely for economic reasons, because the houses get built. They get built in such a way that the builders want to get a profit. The people who own them want to get a profit if they're going to rent out, or the people who buy them are going to have to get a mortgage to it. Now, this means that actually in the United States, for example, probably only about 40 or 50% of the population of the United States can really afford that housing. In other words, that housing which is being built is not affordable for the mass of the population of the United States. And the big fiction is that somehow or other, the private sector will be in a position to be able to take affordable housing. Well, we know that is not the case, because what the private sector does is, if it gets hold of truly affordable housing, that is housing which is held by people with relatively low incomes, what it does basically is either evict them if they're tenants, or put them under huge pressure if they're on mortgage finance, and take over their properties and then do some renovations and then gentrify. So we see gentrification going on all over the place, and gentrification as a global process is essentially antagonistic to affordable housing. So gentrification is the aim of people. Now, how do you manage somehow or other to put together gentrification in such a way as to say that this is the way in which affordable housing can be constructed? And we have a wonderful example here in New York City, and I want to go through it with you just very briefly, because this is a typical Blackstone operation. It turns out that when you try to build affordable housing, of course, it's difficult to get money for it. So one of the ways in which you can do it is you can start to get investment from a large corporation. And the investment from a large corporation, which will allow the conversion of some property into affordable housing, that investment is offset by a tax deduction. This was something that Congress came up with. And so I'll go through about a particular case of this in Bushwick, which is in New York City. There's a Brooklyn housing block, which is run by a thing called Riseborough Community Partnership, which is a sort of charitable institution which runs this affordable housing. The charitable institution needed the money, of course, for the conversion, and it got it by getting AIG, which is a large insurance company, involved in providing the finance. And in return, AIG could apply for a tax deduction. And the situation was that AIG lent something like $2.2 million to the organization, but received in tax credits $3.3 million. So it was a very good deal for AIG. This went on for 15 years. So the way this would go would be that a charitable organization would go to the housing office, the housing ministry of a state, to the state housing administration, and apply for this tax deductible possibility. The state was allocated a certain number of these, so you couldn't do this infinitely, a certain number of these. But if you got the money from this organization backed by the state, then you could build the bill. Now, to do this, in order to be in compliant with IRS rules about, not doing things for tax avoidance reasons, they had to set up a dummy corporation, which was totally controlled by AIG, and sort of 0.9% by the charitable organization. The charitable organization took the rents and managed the property and did all of the things that needed to be done. AIG was just simply providing the financing and getting the tax break in return for the financing. So that was fine. So this went on for 15 years. At the end of 15 years, this arrangement came to an end. And at that point, it was supposed that the organization which brought together the AIG and the community organization would be dissolved, and the properties revert to the ownership of the charitable corporation. But what happened was, when the 15 years was up, AIG said no, it wanted to hang on to them. One of the reasons being that the properties which were in a very derelict area of Bushwick back about 20 years ago, this is now being gentrified. And so AIG said no, it wanted to hold on to the properties. And it was going to hold on to the properties unless the charitable organization came up with $1 or $2 million to actually purchase back from the corporation. So the charitable organization obviously couldn't afford that, so it sued and said, well, the agreement was that it should revert to us. It goes to the court, but there was no kind of written firm agreement. It was all a little bit fuzzy, and the courts decided in favor of AIG. So AIG now is in the position to start to take over the whole housing complex, and the charitable organization will be pushed to one side. But AIG doesn't really want to go into this very much, but it has a lot of these holdings for this tax purposes. So what it's doing is it's turning to Blackstone, which is Stephen Schwarzman's organization, Blackstone, and saying, okay, you can have everything we've got on this for $5 billion. So there's a huge investment coming from private equity firm Blackstone to take over all of this. And Blackstone is willing to take it over because it's a big bet that the courts are going to decide in favor of AIG and the transfer of ownership to Blackstone. So Blackstone will take it over. Blackstone then says, we are perfectly well able to take care of affordable housing. Well, we know what they've done in various other parts of the country when they've done this sort of thing. Affordable housing, first off, is defined by affordable for whom? Affordable for people who earn up to $80,000 is one thing. But half the population of New York City is trying to get by on less than $50,000, less than $40,000. You need affordable, you can't get affordable housing down to that level. And AIG and Blackstone have no idea of doing that. So this is the way in which we're starting to see affordable housing being taken over for commercial purposes by these companies. And this, of course, is what Blackstone did in 2007, 2008. 2007, 2008, nobody really knew very much about Blackstone. They were quite a small player. But what they basically did was to go to the banks, borrow loads and loads of money from all kinds of people and say, all right, we'll go to the banks and we're going to pick up all of the foreclosed properties which exist. And within about 2 or 3 years, Blackstone became one of the largest owners of properties in the United States. And not one, if not the largest owner of properties in the United States. And then it took them over at fire sale prices, fixed them up a bit, put them out for rental. It's an extremely profitable organization. And it has been growing. And it has been active, of course, during the pandemic because a lot of people couldn't pay their rents and so on. It's been picking up more properties. But Blackstone is also operating on this affordable housing stuff, taking over rental properties like the one in Bushwick, and like it did in Detroit, like it's done in San Francisco, like it's done on International. I have colleagues in Barcelona who are upset at the way Blackstone is operating in the housing market in Barcelona. They were operating in Copenhagen, doing exactly the same thing towards affordable housing there. But in that case, they were stopped by public demonstrations on the street. It became so bad publicity that in effect they withdrew. Now they have been operating in China, And now they're trying to position themselves in the Chinese market to say to the Chinese government, we are the private equity company that can come in from outside. We have the expertise to provide affordable housing. So the mountain that Chinese are going to climb is maybe they will climb a little way up the mountain with the help of Blackstone. But the big question is this initiative on part of China to try to find affordable housing for the whole of the population, a decent house, and a decent living environment for everyone, if the Chinese commitment to that is going to be subverted by Chinese temptation to sort of go with Blackstone and see what happens. The situation in Bushwick is that the case has not been determined. The initial court's ruling was in favor of AIG, therefore in favor of Blackstone, and it's now on appeal. If it goes up to the Supreme Court, we know what will happen. So it seems to me that, again, here's an incredible situation where something which was set up in order to have the private sector participate meaningfully in a project to create a decent house and a decent living environment for people of low-income population, that has been perverted over time into something which is about further and further accumulation and power by Blackstone. Meanwhile, Stephen Schwarzman his wealth is one of the top 100 billionaires in the United States right now. I don't know what his wealth is right now, 14 billion. Anyway, it's enough to enable him, and this is the kind of irony of the whole thing. He gives something like $150 million to MIT and about the same amount to Oxford University to encourage and to support the teaching of the humanities. Isn't it wonderful? A very humanistic director. And Stephen Schwarzman obviously is looking forward to sort of going into philanthropy heaven as a result of this. But Stephen Schwarzman is an intense supporter of Donald Trump. So here we have the situation where affordable housing, Stephen Schwarzman, Donald Trump, it all gets put together in a kind of peculiar way, but it's all connected with this thing of affordable housing. And the question of affordable housing on a global level, everywhere, and is a very significant issue. And it cannot be done through the private sector. It absolutely cannot be done. And every time there's some attempt to fix things up so that the private sector can somehow or other do something or other with it, it goes wrong, like this Stephen Schwarzman Blackstone story in Bushwick and the affordable housing that exists over there. So this is, again, a global issue, different in different places depending upon the institutional arrangements, but nevertheless, it is something that is foundational for what an anti-capitalist world could look like, because you have to be anti-capitalist in order to be able to provide affordable housing for people in a decent living environment. That is the only way to do it.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.